hello to you. Today on the Jimquisition, we've got something of a, well, let's say nostalgic vibe. We've had a very varied set list of topics this year, but with the epic layoffs occurring last week, I thought it was time to get a little bit retro, a little bit old school on this show and do what we used to do every single week for about a decade, and that is shit all over corporations being shit. I mean, I say that as if we still don't do that a lot, but in a very special treat, I have for you the return of a very, very special boy. I think you know who he is. Why, it's miniature fantasy Willem Dafoe. He's back. I found him in a box. Hey kids, wanna die? Oh, Willem Dafoe, miniature fantasy thereof. You haven't changed one bit. What have you been up to? I've stolen Jimmy Savile's bones and I'm selling them on the dark web. Who wants a femur? He's not been doing that. He's not been doing that. The video game world was rocked this past week by news that Epic Games, the company behind Fortnite and at least one other game, had been hit with layoffs. Something that is often described as if it's happened to the company, like the weather or a head cold, rather than something the company itself willfully and explicitly did. For example, like I just said there, it was hit with layoffs. Or similarly, something along the lines of suffered layoffs. It's presented as an unavoidable occurrence in which the company takes a passive role because, hey, layoffs are just a reality of the business and something that can't be helped. Pricks. If we wanted to be more accurate in our reporting, what we ought to say is that Epic Games has indulged in layoffs. That's what layoffs are, an indulgence by executives who treat other human beings. Sorry, saying other incorrectly equates an executive with humanity. Let me try that again. An indulgence by executives who treat human beings like commodities. Things whose futures, livelihoods and social security can be picked up and dropped down as and when it benefits them. Executives who shamelessly skim millions of dollars out of a revenue stream generated by the hard work of those who make far less money than they do, yet are jettisoned without remorse to ensure said executives don't have to consider for a second taking a hit to their own exorbitant wealth. Wealth they've convinced themselves they deserve because of our socio-economic system's insistence on attributing the hard work of game developers to the unevidenced and mythical genius of corporate leadership. Again, for the record, pricks. Anyway, Epic is laying off around 16% of staff, roughly 830 people, a decision it's indulged in following a period of aggressive growth and acquisition in which it spent an inordinate amount of money taking control of other companies, not to mention investing in attempted get-richer-quicker schemes. It reminds me of the layoffs we saw Microsoft indulge in earlier this year, where around 1,000 jobs were thrown in the bin, all while the company was sucking up game studios and publishers and continuing to pump obscene amounts of cash into its long and drawn-out acquisition of Activision Blizzard. On a surface-level unrelated note, Capcom president and chairman Haruhiro Sugimoto said at the Tokyo Game Show last week that video game prices were too low, breaking out one of the all-time classic game publisher whinging points that video games are just too expensive to make. What is this, 2012? This is a bitchy little complaint we've roundly demolished on this show over the years, but the game companies continue to peddle because they realise if they just ignore reasonable arguments against their propaganda, nobody interviewing them or reporting their statements in games media publications will bring those arguments up and will instead just uncritically republish the bullshit. I say that Capcom's statement is unrelated to the Epic layoffs on a surface level because while at a glance they are two completely separate situations, they've become quite closely linked in my head as I think about the subject I want to discuss today, the subject of fiscal responsibility, or how game publishers keep painting themselves into a monetary corner before punishing everybody else for their short-sighted fucking stupidity. Tsushimoto's line that rising development costs make games too expensive to sell for a price tag, that the industry at large bumped up to $70 a few years ago during the second major global recession of my lifetime, gets very little sympathy from me for a few reasons. The first reason being that aforementioned global recession. Millennials like myself have seen not one but two major depressions in our lives, the first being the infamous housing market crisis and subsequent fallout in the late 2000s, and the second being, well, just look out the fucking window. On top of that, we've had a global pandemic, instances of ruinous national stupidity like Brexit, a so-called cost of living crisis, though can you really call it a crisis if it was fucking engineered, and the return of fascism, which seems to be about the only thing doing well for itself these days. Basically, people are suffering all over and it's largely the fault of the executive class, who continue to make billions of dollars to split between themselves and their shareholders, while their staff suffer from major wage disparity and have to offer vast chunks of their paychecks to the landlords who have bought up all the available houses and forced everyone else to pay their mortgages for them. Is this getting too political? Or am I just really fucked off with my own landlord who has ignored multiple health and safety complaints and recently started ghosting the letting agent? Look, if you can't afford to be a landlord, don't be a fucking landlord. Pay your mortgage your fucking self like everyone else. Well, the few people who can afford houses these days. When you rent a place, they make you go through all sorts of fucking hoops to prove your income, but you don't have to fucking prove anything to be a landlord. You only have to evidence yourself as a total fucking wanker. God, I've gone wildly off script. Let me simplify it. Video games are a fucking disposable luxury, and I think the game industry knows it. People make a big performance out of the fact that video games didn't raise their prices for decades and haven't soared in line with inflation, but I truly believe that on some level, publishers do realise that if people are being forced to work multiple jobs for pay that mostly goes toward rent and the rising costs of living, raising the cost of games to like $100 or more will eventually lead to a lot less software being sold. Game publishers have proven without fail that the moment they can get away with something, they will do it. If they thought they could get away with an exponential rise in a video game's MSRP, they'd have fucking done it. No, they're not going to be so bold, so direct. They have raised prices, more than the $70, but we'll get to that in a moment. For now, let's just say that the baseline cost of games is a game of chicken that publishers right now are unwilling to play.
Ladies, I'm only human.
Now, Capcom's president doesn't see it that way apparently, believing that lowered incomes and heightened living costs won't deter people from buying video games. Business confidence and high prices have little to do with the game industry, he said rather fucking callously and selfishly. Just because there's a recession doesn't mean you won't go to the movie theatre or go to your favourite artist's concert. High quality games will continue to sell. Yeah? Okay, then do it. Do it, bitch. Raise prices, do it now, see what happens. But anyway, just think about what he said there for a moment. Just because there's a recession. Just. As if it's no big deal. Which, when you're an overpaid suit who makes most of his money off the backs of lower paid artists actually making these high quality games, it's not that big of a deal at all, I guess. Just remember that whenever you hear corporate mouthpieces talk about recessions and the cost of living, they have plenty of opinions about it, but they're not the ones living in fear of it every day. Which brings me to my personal favourite point. Video game executives shouldn't get to complain about the cost of making video games until they address the cost of paying video game executives. Let's look at a company that absolutely adores indulging in layoffs and is quite tied up in everything we're talking about today, Activision Blizzard. Activision, which as I always like to point out, pays zero tax dollars because of a haven it's set up in Holland and instead gets a refund on that $0 that we all have to pay, has a CEO with a net worth of $7 billion who nonetheless takes tens of millions of more dollars home every year and then several more million in performance bonuses and perks. That's on top of legalized insider trading schemes like stock buybacks and the fact that pay disparity at the company is so bad that many employees cannot afford to use Activision's own cafeteria. And that's just Bobby Kotick. Activision employs many executives, each of whom are paid millions of dollars a year and are often given lump sums of enticement and loyalty bonuses upon being hired, reaping more money than hundreds of Activision Blizzard's employees could ever save in their lifetimes, even if they were pooling their resources, all before they've actually done anything. And then, at the same time, it boasts of record revenue and billions of dollars that go into the pockets of shareholders, they lay off hundreds of people just to maintain the illusion that the company's continuing to grow at a pace that'll satisfy investors. Pricks. We're supposed to believe that video games are just too expensive to make in the face of shit like that. I'm not going to pretend that it's cheap to make top-of-the-line AAA games, but honestly, I ain't interested in touching upon the cost of development until the cost of so-called management is addressed, because let me tell you, these executive officers, many of whom oversee systemic abuse and harassment at their companies and either permit it or engage in it, provide very little value to the corporations as far as I can see. If anything, they get in the way. I'll never forget the term that was used to describe Bethesda's Todd Howard in this regard: seagull. Someone who flies in, shits all over everything, and flaps off. I've spoken to a lot of developers in my time, and whenever I hear about poor workplace conditions, development problems, major hindrances and delays with a game, 9 times out of 10, the reason for the trouble was the so-called leadership. Whether it's Rockstar inflating its dev costs by having stressed out artists work on graphical luxuries that add nothing to the final product, or the notorious case of Anthem becoming a disorganized, directionless mess because studio heads kept changing their minds and desperately chasing the live service bubble, or Square Enix fucking over the developers of Deus Ex and planning a trilogy that never got a third game, while refusing to invest in the last console generation because they thought consoles were gonna die, or Konami being Konami, my decade plus of following the game industry has led me to the conclusion, and it's a conclusion I'll take to the fucking grave, that so-called leadership in the video game industry is made up of clueless cronies who failed upwards, took credit for other people's labour, and passed the buck when their own flailing attempts to meddle in creative processes they had no fucking experience or insight in derailed projects. The average corporate structure of a major game publisher is full of seagulls that produce bigger and bigger quantities of bird shit the further up the company ladder you go. When I saw the headline about what Capcom's chairman said, my first thought was a lot simpler than all of this. It was simply, nobody's forcing you to spend so much money, bruh. For as much expectation as there may be for big budget games to approach a certain visual standard that has inevitably grown more luxurious over time, certain studios are indulgent to a point of patent fucking absurdity. I love remembering when Square Enix complained about the 2013 Tomb Raider not selling enough copies after it proudly advertised the fact Lara Croft had individually animated strands of hair. Like, what the fuck? At what point did those strands of hair make the game more enjoyable to play? Who even fucking noticed them? When I play games, I sure as shit don't sit there examining the hairlines of the female characters with envy, thinking, God, I sure hope HRT fills out mine as gorgeously as that. I mean, moving on. There have been some fucking beautiful, lavish, expensive-ass games released this year, and of them, I can think of only one so far in the mainstream space that actually stood out for its high quality as entertainment, as well as a graphics card benchmark: Baldur's Gate 3, a title that was itself developed in an unconventional manner and could add to itself incrementally through judicious use of early access. When I think of the other releases that truly set themselves apart for me this year, one pair strike me in particular: Bone Razor Minions and Clash Artifacts of Chaos. Two games that are visually delightful in their own way, not because they use cutting-edge visual techniques that cost millions to put together, but because of some truly sublime art direction with distinct styles. On top of that, and more crucially, both of those games are fucking brilliant to play, unique experiences that offer memorable entertainment, and in the case of Clash, some of the most emotionally effective storytelling I've had the privilege of enjoying in a video game. There is a reason thing. The Wii was the most successful console in Christendom, despite its hardware being so far behind the 360 and PS3. There's a reason the Switch is a mega success that has lasted for, God, has it been fucking 8 years? Something absurd? I know, I'll Google it later. Nintendo nailed decades ago that strong art direction and just, being a good fucking game is gonna blow the bloated budgets of Ubisoft out of the fucking water every time. Now look, I know the graphics are important, and I'm not saying I'm personally unimpressed by gorgeous lavish visuals, but like I've said for fucking years, the most popular games of all time have never rolled out the red carpet for Nvidia. Minecraft, Among Us, everything Valve ever made, these sales powerhouses have wriggled their way into the minds of players using simple graphics, or engines so old as to be considered for Dreadnought service. I mean, hell, just look at how successful Starfield's been this year, and it's basically a reskinned Fallout 3. What? Oh, what though? What though? You know I'm fucking right. Jesus! Rising development costs are not an entirely self-made problem. Tech does get more expensive. Despite the resistance to paying workers more, sometimes wages do begrudgingly go up at these companies, though nowhere near as much as they fucking should. But it's a self-exacerbated problem when you have studios making new engines all the time, having horses shit in real time, and then having an entire half of a game's budget go on marketing. Then again, when you consider that for all their whining, many of these corporations are continually claiming to earn record revenue, and the game industry overall just keeps making more and more money per annum, are we sure that these companies are actually worried about tightening their belts? Or is it the greed talking? Is it the fact that, like we discussed last week, games are constantly bumping their heads on the glass ceiling of their own promises to investors that they'll just keep getting richer and richer and becoming increasingly desperate when that promise becomes harder to keep once they've so aggressively monetized their products till there's no more blood left in the stone? Which of course brings us naturally to the fact that long before most publishers embraced the $70 price point, mainstream games had raised their prices above $60 indirectly and surreptitiously. I talked about this years ago in a video called The $60 Myth, where I pointed out that as games whittled down acceptable content standards for a base game and sold those whittlings as downloadable content, season pass offerings, deluxe edition incentives, and microtransaction fodder, publishers got far more than the on-paper MSRP in increasingly underhanded ways. With the advent of the so-called live service, this method of secret price hiking reached egregious new lows as blatantly unfinished, content-poor games launched with the promise of being worth buying upon completion of a roadmap of updates that often weren't followed because the developers had to waste their time and resources fixing inevitably rushed and defective products. Over time, games offered less content for more money overall, all while maintaining the paper-thin but nonetheless grimly successful illusion that they'd never raised prices. It's genius, really. I'd be impressed if I was an avaricious, amoral, despicable fucking Speaking of illusions, and of having your cake and fucking it too, of doing something in such a way you can hide the fact you did it, at least one former employee of a certain influential game studio offered me a rare bit of insight as to what might be happening with all these layoffs we see in the game industry, or rather, the ones we don't see. Although what you can see is how we've circled it right back to the shit we spoke of at the top of the video because I'm a really good writer. Basically, there might be more layoffs than we've actually been seeing with our eyes, but they're not classed as layoffs because of how workers are being classified.
In other words, it's a system.
Studios more and more are outsourcing their work or keeping staff on probationary periods and dangling a carrot of full-time employment. It's just something to keep in mind with companies that claim to have had little to no layoffs. They might be engaging in the no layoff myth, something I'm currently attempting to dig more into for a full report. Anyway, Epic Games did what Microsoft was doing when it laid off hundreds of jobs and ruined hundreds of lives in the process. It was spending stupid amounts of money for its own indulgence and damning the consequences because corporations are short-sighted dickheads who refuse to see past the next financial quarter and literally don't know how to build things of lasting value. No, they just acquire the things that do and then strip that value down. They're like America with other people's cultures. At the very least, Epic's Tim Sweeney had the fortitude to straight up say that Epic was spending more money than it was earning, but tried to spin it as if it was a noble mistake. Investing in the next evolution of Epic and growing Fortnite as a metaverse-inspired ecosystem for creators. Ugh. Basically, like so many other companies, Epic was desperately chasing the rickety bandwagon of pretend money that was grotesquely typified by the rise and hilarious fall of NFTs. Critics like myself were screaming from the rooftop that glomming onto ill-conceived libertarian paradises like the Metaverse was a shitty idea, but of course I don't have the glorified comic book that is a business degree, so what do I know? Fundamentally, self-sustaining anuses like Tim Sweeney get to make grievously stupid mistakes that even an empty-headed impulse toy purchaser with cock on the brain could tell were bad ideas, and he gets to keep his job. When companies do well, executives get performance bonuses. When companies do badly, or even just slightly not as good as previously, executives lay a bunch of people off. Always rewarded, never punished. The only pay cuts they've ever taken are performative at best. It's also worth noting that Epic in particular may have used these layoffs to its own malicious advantage. During the company's little restructuring endeavour, it took the opportunity to divest Bandcamp, getting rid of the asset it had acquired in 2022. As was pointed out to me by fan of the show Ed, Bandcamp reported a change in working conditions after the acquisition and made moves to organise, successfully forming a union in March of 2023. Now, it's worth noting that with this recent divestment, Bandcamp has changed hands twice in 2 years, so pointing at unionisation as the reason for selling it off isn't something I can do. However, I can say that Epic, which has a history of abusing its workers with coerced overtime and the crunch culture associated with terrible management, certainly has just offloaded one of the few things corpos fear, a workforce with a voice. So congrats to them, I guess? Speaking again as a millennial, I've spent years being told that my generation is irresponsible with its money, that the people who struggle to make rent despite holding down multiple jobs have only themselves to blame, amid accusations of buying too many lattes and too much avocado toast. Just save your money better, lectured a media that showcased how wiser, better people were able to live frugally and smartly off the back of $1 million loans from their wealthy fathers. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, sneered politicians who oversaw stagnant wages and rapid inflation, ensuring that the holidays and cars and homes previous generations took for granted became unobtainable dreams. Just work harder if you can't afford rent, snarked landlords who hoarded property and didn't lift a finger to extract the lion's share of other people's paychecks. Meanwhile, corporations can make as many financial mistakes as they like and get huge bailouts from the government while their execs fit themselves with golden parachutes. I bring this up bitterly and resentfully because as individuals we have had financial responsibility drummed into our heads by the very people who don't know what real work looks like and who have always been privileged enough to spend first and never need to think about it later. These out-of-touch old dipshits from a generation that robbed its children blind exhibit none of the accountability they project onto others. Indeed, those very same others are the ones who take the fall for their follies. Microsoft apparently failed so hard it needed to axe over 1,000 jobs, yet it's still allowed to buy new toys in the form of companies like Activision Blizzard. Epic Games blew its income on a gamble, and while we're supposed to believe someone who spunks their savings in Las Vegas deserves to lose it all, Epic spending money it didn't have to chase imagined profits in the demonstrably unsustainable Metaverse makes sure that the people who earn the money for it in the first place are the ones who take the loss. Video game bosses need to have some fiscal responsibility, you know? Pull themselves up by their bootstraps, work harder, and stop wasting their money on Activado toast. Bloody moleculatives. To circle back to one of the subjects we were touching upon on today's video, I've been playing all weekend a game called El Paso Elsewhere, which is janky as fuck and looks like a very early PS2 game, but as a game that is basically Max Payne but with a really cool story and like excellent writing and that, it's fucking good. And again, doesn't look all that brilliant if we compare them on a straight technological level to, say, Horizon or something. Smash the glass there. But that put me off, Willem Dafoe, you put me off. Thank God for me.